Hi everyone, my name is Julie Turner. Welcome to the PnP Virtual Conference. Today we're going to talk about the PnPJS library and async await, a way to use those two things together to make your SharePoint framework code sing. So a little quick intro about myself. Like I said, my name is Julie Turner. I am the partner and CTO with Sympraxis Consulting. We're a small 6-person consulting firm in the northeast section of the United States. I personally have been working with SharePoint since the 2007 version, and I've been a Microsoft MVP in the Office Apps and Services area since 2017, and also a PnP team member since 2019. I have a couple links here. One is to my GitHub repo. There's a public samples folder in my repo that will have copies of all the code that I'm going to share today, and copies of code from all my previous demos ever given, and blog posts and all of those things. And speaking of my blog is at julieturner.net, which I haven't posted to recently, but I'll probably be doing some new content soon. So to dive right in, when I give this presentation in person, I would often like to sort of set the tone so people can run away quickly if they need to. So are you in the right spot? Basically, I want to set the tone that this content is going to be for developers who've done some client-side dev in SharePoint and that are very familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript, and hopefully understand promises at some basic level. I am going to go through promises fairly thoroughly, so if you don't necessarily run away, but understand that we're going to be talking at that level today. So I just want to level set and make sure everybody's ready to go. Okay, our agenda. It's short and sweet, 30 minutes today. So we're going to start with going over what PnPJS is, and hopefully give you a flavor of what that library is and what it can do for you. And then we'll talk about what async await is specifically, and how that relates to promises. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time doing a very in-depth demo of the async await pattern using the PnPJS library, so putting those two things together. So let's start by just quickly giving an overview of what the PnPJS library is. So it's an open source initiative. It is wholly created and maintained by the community, and it's a work of love. There's a few of us who try to maintain the code base, maintain the documentation, answer questions in the issues list in the GitHub repo. And we do that as best we can, and hopefully we're able to help anyone who needs assistance. The library itself is a fluent library for accessing SharePoint and Office 365 REST APIs in a type-safe way. So it makes it a little simpler by providing this fluent style of programming that I'll sort of show you in a few minutes, to access those REST endpoints without actually having to necessarily know what the next thing is, which can be arduous. In general, the library is used by more than 12,000 tenants, and it's generating over 4 billion requests each month. So that's a lot of use, and we're really excited that it's taken on such a life of its own, and that it's really helping people out there get their work done. We absolutely accept and encourage contributions from the community and constructive feedback when necessary. We do the best we can, but obviously your contributions can go a long way, and if you have suggestions, we're absolutely open to hearing those. Okay, so PnPJS can be used in a bunch of different ways. Not only can it be used in your SharePoint framework projects, which could include things that would be deployed into SharePoint or Teams, or now as a Outlook add-in, but it also can be used in your server-side code when you're using Node.js, and it also can be used in your SPA applications that are outside of the SharePoint or Office 365 landscape, and just your straight up web applications that are written in JavaScript or TypeScript. So it has a breadth of uses, but it basically gives you access to all of the Office 365 APIs, but primarily to the SharePoint ones. So when I say Fluent API and what that really gives you is, in general, if you're going to access the RESTful endpoints, you need to be able to submit a post request or a GET request or a patch request to a particular URL, including some configuration in that, and then you would get back a payload that you would have to then convert into JSON, and then you would be able to work forward from there. And it takes a lot of effort to sort of remember what those URLs are, to format those URLs, and then to deal with the requests and the responses. And so what this library intends to do is make that significantly simpler by providing you this Fluent methodology for accessing the content. So you can see here on the screen, it's, your web, your list by a title, your items. And then once you request what you want, you get those results back in a JSON format without having to do that extra step of converting it into JSON. So if you want to start trying to use the PnPJS library, highly encouraged, you can go to the documentation, which is at pnp.github.io/PnPJS. And I highly encourage you to go through at least the getting started information. We work really hard on the documentation. We're constantly improving it. And by going through that getting started documentation, it's going to help you make sure you start things off on the right foot. And then when you need more assistance, if the documentation under the packages area or the library concepts don't get you where you need to go, you at least know that you've started off on the right foot and you are able to ask more concise questions in our issues list, and that can help us help you more easily. So when we talk about async await, if you're familiar with programming in JavaScript, then you're definitely familiar with programming using promises, because the browser is an synchronous interface for RESTful endpoints on the server. And so you need to basically submit a request via a promise and then have code that's going to execute on the return. So a good example of this is in the SharePoint framework. We often use the on-init protected method, and that on-init method returns a promise. And so we would then say that we are going to return a promise that once the on-init function completes, then we want to set up our PnP JS library by using the SP setup method, and then we might do some calls against that. But we need to wait for that on-init function to happen. And this is super, it works great, but it's a little bit hard to read and it's a little bit hard to consume. So a different pattern is the async await pattern. And so this is, if anybody's written C#, you're probably already familiar with this. But by adding the decorator async before our function name, you can then use the await keyword. And by putting that await keyword in there, it turns what appears to be asynchronous code into synchronous code. And it actually is still running asynchronously, but it appears and is visual to us, and we understand the logic in more of a synchronous way. So we know that by putting this await keyword in front of our call, that it's not going to move on to make the SP setup call until this promise is returned. And so you can see by looking at this that this is significantly more simple to understand and consume and to debug, honestly. So that's our goal for today, is to sort of switch our mindset from using traditional promises into using this async await pattern. And so next, we're going to dive in and do a pretty in-depth demo about how we can build with async await versus using promises. Okay, so what we've done so far is to create our SharePoint framework solution. So we just did a vanilla, plain old Yo at Microsoft SharePoint, and created that SharePoint Framework web part project. And now we're going to do one extra step, and that is to npm install the @pnp/sp library. And so that installs the entire library into our package.json. And so if we open our package.json file up, you can see now right there on line 20 that we have the latest @pnp/sp library installed. So we need to do that first and foremost so that we can use the library. Okay, so then next we're going to just do some setup stuff. So I'm going to add, so we have this component by default built in. So we have the async await demo web part, which is the main file that the code starts from. But we have this by default one component in there. And so that component is just going to be our measly UI with a button in it. But I do need to set it up slightly. So I'm going to start by setting up some properties for my component. So I'll come in here and I'll change this so that I have a type, which is just going to be a string that tells me if I'm doing promises or async, a time, which in a more elaborate demo, I would be showing you the timing differences, that they're very similar between promises and async await. We won't be doing that in this demo, but that's what that's for. And then a start function that just launches our code, which is in our main web part file. We just need a way to pass that back, the command that we've clicked the button back up through. And so that's what that property is for. So then we'll quickly go into our async await demo file, and we're going to just swap out the default demo code that comes with the solution for our really simple basic UI, which just has, you know, a label on it with that type and then the time if we were passing it through, plus a start button. And we'll take out this extra escape line just to clean things up. Okay, so now we're back in our main async await web part. Okay, so obviously we need to do our imports at this point. So I'm going to import the SP object from the PnP SP root library, but our library supports selective imports. And so in addition, I'm going to include some other imports for webs, fields, lists, views, etc. Then I'm going to set up the time variable that I would need and set up the call for my onInit function, which then calls my SP setup. And that's what we call establishing context for the SP library and how it knows what web you're in and what site you're on, etc., so that it knows how to communicate with SharePoint effectively. And so then the last thing we want to do is that component that we set up, we now have to feed it the right pieces of information to the properties that we defined. So instead of description, we now have, as we said before, the type and the time. And the type I'm just going to set to async because I'm only going to show the async example as a demo, and the time is the time variable, but we're not going to use that today. And then last but not least, I need to have a function, and in this case just a dummy function to get started for the start function. Okay, so now if I come back over to my command window, then I'm just going to do a gulp serve with the no browser option, and then come on over to my browser where I have the workbench set up in a particular site, because I'm going to be using PnPJS to effectively create lists and fields and views, etc. in a site. I need to actually have a workbench that's in a site so that I can do that. I can't use the local workbench because there is no, I'd have to mock everything because there is really no SharePoint in existence that we can effectively act against. So we have the workbench running in a site collection that I have called demos, and I've already, because I've served my solution up, I've already got it added into the workbench, and our incredibly ugly but simple and effective UI here with our start button that calls our start function. So I'm going to start by creating a method that I'm going to call step1promise, and I'm going to pass in a list name. That way, later I can, when I want to call this method a bunch of times, I can change the list name. So I'm going to start creating this method, and then I'm going to start by returning a new promise. And so I'm going to just have a resolve method. And inside of that resolve method, I'm going to start by calling, well, first I need to start by creating some extra variables. So let me get the imports in for those variables. So now we're going to make the calls to SharePoint to create our list. So let's start by making the call to sp.web.list to add the list name. And since we're using the promises method, we're going to call the .then to get our list results. And so what we would do next is inside of that promise then function, we're going to check to see if our list results has a value. If it doesn't, we're going to resolve false. The next step is to then put the list results list on the L variable so that we can use it later in one of the other promise chains in the promise. We're going to create the text field by returning the promise that is the text, adding the text field. So on our list, L.field, so the fields on the list, I want to add a new text field to that, and I'm going to call that field step1 text field. And so then if we had an error on our promise that we called, it's going to come out in the second section of this. So we have to add another method for list reject. And so list reject then is just going to simply console log an error and resolve false. So our next step is to deal with the field result. So from our previous step on line 47, we returned a promise. And so this entire then function needs to have another then to chain the promises together for the field result. So we have the field result. We're going to do something extremely similar. We're going to say if I don't have a field result at all, then I'm going to assume there was some sort of problem. I'm going to resolve to false. Then I'm going to set our f variable to the field result data, which is the type partial field info. And then I want to create the view. So I'm now creating the view by returning the L for our list, L.views. I want to add a view called step1 view, and I'm returning that promise. Then the next step is the view result. I gotta handle the view being added. So then if the view result happens, I want to again check. If I didn't get a view result value, I'm going to resolve false. If I do, I'm going to elevate it to the v variable so that I can use it later. And then I'm going to add the field to the view. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to return a promise using the view.fields.add, and then I'm going to use the f variable that was the field info.internal name because I want to add that field that I created to the fields of the view. And then finally, I need to handle the rejection of the promise. And then last but not least, I need to handle the promise of adding the field to the view. And so then I'm just going to say that it resolves true because the whole thing is successful. And finally, handle it if that was rejected. So you can see this is a long string of code that I had to put together to do that promise chaining, to do that set of steps. So now what we want to do is do the same thing but use the async await method. So I'm going to start again by creating a new method, and this time you're going to notice that I have that async decorator before my method name. So this one's called step1 async. Again, I want to pass in the list name. And then what I'm going to do is what I kind of consider the standard shell of an async await function. I'm going to define my return variable. In this case, my return value is a Boolean, and it's going to be by default false. And then I'm going to add a try catch. And so that try catch is how we do error handling in async await instead of the various reject functions. So the try catch will catch any rejected promises and throw them to the catch. And then after everything, we're going to return the return val. And so this is why my return val is going to be false by default, because if anything is trapped in here, the catch is just going to include a console log, but it doesn't need to do anything else because the value of return val will still be false, because I'm going to wait until all of my steps are complete before I set return val to true. Okay, so now let's start to walk through what we need. We're going to create the list first, and so I'm going to say let my list result equal await, and then the sp.web.list.add list name, and then just a semicolon is only needed. So you can see how much more simple that's going to be than the .then. So now all we have to do, because it's going to wait, this list result isn't going to have a value until this promise returns. So we know that on line 88, list result is going to have a value, so I can just test it. So I'm going to say if list result, then continue. So here we are with list result.list has a value, and then I'm going to say, okay, if it has a value, then create the text field. So now we have to say let the field result equal await, and then we're going to just use the list result dot list here instead of the L variable, right? Dot fields dot add text, and then the field name that I want to call it. Okay, and then let's check if field result has a value, because again, we know that field result won't have a value until the promise returns. If it does, and then we're going to let the view result await the list result dot list dot views dot add, and then we're going to just give the view a name. So now let's say if the view result dot view has a value, then finally let's add the text field to the view. And so our final call is just to await view result dot view dot fields dot add, and then our internal name from our field result data internal name. There we go. And again, we're just awaiting that because it doesn't return any object. It's just 200 error or 200 result. So there we go with our asynchronous version of the function. You can see just looking at it how much more simple and easy and obvious what is happening is compared to the promise chaining version of the code. So now let's just go take a look at it. So we'll start by first coming down here and modifying our start function so that it actually calls our async method just like that. But what we need to do is to put a list name in here. So I'm going to just call it test async. And then we're going to go over to our browser and we're going to click the start button. And now if I come over to my site contents and we refresh our page, we're going to see our test async 1 list is in our site contents. And then if we look at our views, we have step 1 view, lo and behold, and our field. So that was awesome. Okay, so we've pasted our step 2 promise in here right away. So let me just go over this. Basically, our step 2 is going to be that we want to create 3 instances of the list. And so the reason I wanted to include this is to sort of show you parallel processing from a promise perspective. So this is a common pattern where you have 3 things that can happen simultaneously. And as long as they're all finished, you know you can move on. So that's a common pattern. And so I just want to quickly show how this would be written asynchronously so that it's understood, but it's not going to be as much of an improvement as our first example was. So let's come down here and start writing our async await version of the same method. So we're going to start by doing a step 2 async method, where we're going to return a promise that's a Boolean, and then we're going to do a similar thing here. I said before, this is a pattern I like to use, so I'm going to let the return val equal true. I'm going to put a try catch in, and then I'm going to set my return val to return my return val, and I'll put my console log in my catch. There we are, and finally, we'll start writing our code. So this is going to look really similar. We're going to need an array of promises, and then we're going to push onto that array the call to the step 1, although we'll use the async version of this. And since we have that list name we can pass in, we're just going to put those names in there. And we'll call that 3 times and then change our call 2 and 3. There we go. And then what we want to do instead is we're going to do const results, and then we're going to await the promises.all with our array in it. And I forgot to put the async decorator on there, so let me go back and type that. There we go. And now I know that results is going to have a value of an array of Boolean values already. So now I just have to operate on those Boolean values, and there's probably better ways to do that, but for clarity of code, let me just do a quick for loop. It's probably a little bit of overkill here. There's definitely better ways to do this, but I just want it to be clear. So I'm just going to loop through the results, and if any of the results, are false, then I'll set the return val to false there. And so that gives us exactly the same functionality that the other one did, just in an async await pattern. And again, this isn't significantly improved from an understandability perspective, but I wanted to definitely show how you would do it that way. So now all we need to do is go down and change our call. So instead of doing the step 1 async, we're going to do step 2 async, and we don't need the list name anymore. And then we'll come over here and I'll refresh. And now when I click start here, it's going to create all of those libraries, or lists, excuse me. And so there we can see it, 1, 2, 3 lists. So let's come back over here and check our view. And lo and behold, we have exactly what we expected. So that wraps up my demo portion of my presentation and my presentation altogether. I really hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you would like to provide us feedback, we'd love to have it. So you can use this nice little character code thingy here, or go to aka.ms/PnPVC feedback and give us feedback on the conference. Really appreciate you joining me here today, and I thank you for your participation, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.